7th century Arabia was a harsh, geographically isolated environment. Yet from this unforgiving landscape, Prophet Muhammad made highly specific, historically verifiable claims about the future of global civilization. Academia tests historical prophecies against 3 skeptical filters. The vague guess asks if a prediction is just a broad, safe bet. The self-fulfilling prophecy checks whether believers manipulated outcomes. Finally, Eventu tests for retroactive forgery, checking if writers recorded history after it happened. We are going to run a specific set of these 7th century predictions through 3 academic crucibles. We need to see if they break under scrutiny, or if their accuracy suggests a depth of foresight that standard historical filters can't account for. Let's test the vague guess theory against the geopolitical reality of the early 7th century. The Byzantine Empire had just suffered a devastating defeat by the Sassanid Persians. They lost Syria, Damascus fell, and Jerusalem was sacked. The empire was pushed to the brink of total dissolution. Right at this moment of absolute defeat, a verse in the Quran, Surah Ar-Rum, was revealed. It stated the Romans had been defeated, but that they would overcome their enemy within a specific linguistic framework, bid sinin, an Arabic term explicitly denoting a period of 3 to 9 years. Predicting that an empire might eventually win a future battle is a safe guess. Guaranteeing a complete geopolitical reversal within a maximum 9-year countdown is a significant statistical risk. Yet, exactly 7 years later, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a counteroffensive and secured a decisive victory against the Persians. Skeptics often point to disease as another easy guess. Plagues occur frequently in the ancient world, so a generalized warning about sickness is an easy hit. This chart maps out a chronological sequence detailed by the prophet during the Tabuk expedition. He did not issue a standalone guess about illness. He outlined an exact progression. First, his own death. Second, the peaceful conquest of Jerusalem. Third, a massive plague that would hit the community immediately after. The historical record aligns with this sequence. The prophet passed away in 632. Jerusalem was conquered in 637. Immediately following that triumph, in 638, the plague of Amwaz erupted in the Levant. It devastated the military camps rapidly, matching the wording of the prediction, killing like a plague of sheep. A lucky guess relies on ambiguity. Precise mathematical deadlines and strict sequential ordering challenge the possibility of a vague generalization. Our second crucible tests human nature. Could early Muslims have actively engineered their own history to make sure these prophecies came true? Decades after the prophet's passing, the Islamic Empire was fractured by a massive civil war. His grandson, Al-Hassan, was legitimately elected as the caliph, commanding a massive and undefeated army. Standard political logic suggests a ruler uses his military advantage to secure his empire. Instead, Al-Hassan engaged in diplomacy and voluntarily surrendered his rule to the opposing Syrian forces. He explicitly cited his motivation, acting upon a childhood prophecy that he would grow up to be a peacemaker who reconciles 2 massive factions. Abdicating power for peace is rare, but promising the fall of a global superpower while in a position of total vulnerability is another matter entirely. In 622, the prophet was a hunted refugee fleeing Mecca with a massive bounty on his head. An assassin and tracker named Siraka caught up to him. During a tense standoff that ended in a truce, the prophet, entirely destitute and lacking an army, promised this bounty hunter that he would one day wear the legendary golden bracelets of the Persian emperor. Decades later, Muslim forces dismantled the Sassanid superpower. When the royal treasures were brought to Medina, Caliph Umar summoned the now elderly Siraka and placed the vanquished emperor's heavy gold bracelets onto his wrists. If early Muslims were inventing propaganda stories to justify their conquests, they would frame them around triumphant victories. Creating a narrative where a desperate refugee guarantees the crown jewels of the world's greatest superpower to an assassin contradicts the typical patterns of political fabrication. This brings us to the final defense, ex eventu, the argument that highly accurate texts were written by historians after the events already occurred. Consider the prophet's warning of a future conflict against an unknown adversary. He described them with specific anthropological detail, small eyes, broad faces resembling hammered leather shields, and wearing shoes made of hair. 6 centuries later, the Mongol military machine burst out of the Eurasian steppe and devastated the eastern Muslim lands. The invaders possessed the facial morphology and wore the distinct fur and animal hair boots matching the 7th century description. Then we have an explicit socio-economic forecast. The prophet predicted that destitute, barefoot shepherds of the desert would experience a massive reversal of wealth, eventually competing with one another to build exceptionally tall structures. This diagram plots the timeline of manuscript codification against physical history. The collections containing these exact prophecies were authenticated and widely disseminated by the 9th century. The Mongol invasions hit in the 13th century. The Gulf state skyscraper boom didn't begin until the 20th century. Because the texts were locked into the historical record hundreds of years before the physical events materialized, retroactive forgery is chronologically and historically unsupported. When tested, these specific historical texts survive the academic crucibles. They rely on strict chronological sequencing. They defy standard psychological logic for fabrication, and they demonstrably predate the events they describe. These predictions operate as empirical anomalies in the historical record. They forecasted exact trajectories of human civilization with a level of precision that challenges the limits of standard historical skepticism. What began as words spoken in the isolation of the 7th century desert eventually found physical realization in the present day. The descendants of those who lived in tents transitioned into the rulers of wealthy modern nations, and the physical fulfillment of those ancient words is visible in the skylines towering over the region today.